I want to share this story with you that up until this point, I've only shared with family and a few friends. But it's such an incredible story that somebody needs to hear this. And so now I'm sharing it with you. But my wife and I, went into the adoption process several years ago. It was back in 2018. In fact, we just finalized a few months ago. We adopted a little boy back in March. And the little boy name was 8-year-old boy. His name is David Cantu. Well, back before that, my wife and I, we were friends with this couple, and they had just started taking care of their grandbaby. They had a little tiny baby. I mean, this baby wasn't 2 hands full. She was tiny, and probably one of the most beautiful little babies I've ever seen. She was adorable. Well, I saw this little girl grow up. She was standing up and then walking and then talking. And years later, I guess she was probably about 4 years old. When I got ready to leave, I would tell her, "Bye, Kinley." And she would say, "Bye, John." And she would always come up with a last name. "Bye, John this. Bye, John that. Bye, John Cena." So she would always come up with a last name. Well, one day, as I was leaving, I said, "Bye, Kinley." And she said, "Bye, John David." And from the time I would walk out the front door to the time I got in my truck, she was calling John David. "Bye, John David. Bye, John David." From that point on, every time I would go, it was always John David. She never came up with another name. John David was it. So, fast forward, just a few months ago, well, actually back in March, about halfway through, the finalization process is about 6 months. So we're trying to determine, it's time to determine what name we're going to put on the birth certificate. And David, he decides he's really not that fond of his first name, David. Really wasn't that fond of it. So he wanted to take his adopted dad's first name. And he was okay with his middle name being David. My first name, John. His name would be John David. You can't make this stuff up. And if you think God doesn't have a sense of humor, if you don't think he's paying attention, he is. Now, ultimately, John David settled for John Henry. He wanted to have my first and middle name. However, he didn't want any confusion when mom says, "John, well, which John?" So he decided he liked Henry. So now we call him Henry. He likes Henry. That's what he goes by. His teachers at school called him Henry. But for that brief moment, it was God's way of saying, I was there all along. And I was speaking to you through this little girl. You know, I often say sometimes when God speaks to us, he whispers. And sometimes he speaks in a bellowing voice. And this was one of those moments where he was screaming. Yeah, that was me. I hope that this message inspires you. And don't forget to share it with somebody else. Share it on your social media. Share it with your friends. Share it with your church.